due date for homework 5 is pushed back to Friday, just because of the class cancellation on Monday. So that'll give us some additional time to do back and forth if you've got questions on the assignment. And I know that last problem's a doozy. You've got a lot of units conversions there. It's a lot of steps. And so my suggestion is, even if you don't have a view of the entirety of the problem before you begin, like if you don't have a clear solution path in your mind, just start doing units conversions. You know how many gallons are in that barrel of the coagulant, so convert that into the metric units that you're going to need, since the concentration is in terms of milligrams per liter. And so just start with the units conversion and see where that takes you. But Friday before class is when you should submit homework number 5. Any announcement questions? Go ahead.
If you're planning on driving to the bridge, what do you do about parking?
We have a kind of a rally point planned by, there's an auto dealer near the Nitro Bridge, and there's a long gravel road beside the auto dealer. And so I think that we're going to be able to accommodate people who are driving separately. And on the RSVP, you can indicate whether you're going to drive separate and whether you can take other people, or if you're going to go straight from the tour somewhere else and you can't drive anyone, you can indicate that as well. But there will be parking. Go ahead.
For our exam on Wednesday up next week, is that also going to cover sedimentation?
Let me take a look at where things stand with the exam. So I don't want to say what will and won't be on it yet. But sedimentation, you're asking, is because that was introduced after our first midterm exam. And so my first reflex is to say yes, but I'll take another look at the schedule and we'll talk about what's on it and what's not on it. Any other questions? All right. So we're shifting gears a little bit. This course, Civil Engineering 434, is Advanced Water and Wastewater Treatment. And so we've talked a lot about water treatment, and some of the principles apply to both. Principles of settling apply to both water and wastewater. Principles of disinfection apply to both water and wastewater. And of course, chemical handling and demand estimation, there's a lot of overlap. But there are some obviously unique aspects of wastewater treatment. And so in Chapter 18, the text kind of dives into what are the characteristics of wastewater, a little bit about the impacts of how we collect it, and then some general design considerations. So let's just jump into that with some definitions. And it's maybe the greatest euphemism of all time, calling it sanitary wastewater. I mean, it's just a true contradiction in terms, because it's certainly not sanitary. But domestic or sanitary wastewater, what we usually mean by that is wastewater that's coming from places that aren't having any kind of industrial process or commercial process that alters the wastewater beyond just the human use aspect. And so it's wastewater that may have a little bit of food residue in it, from people rinsing off dishes. It obviously is going to have human waste in it. And so it's the baseline assumption is domestic and sanitary wastewater is in the strength that we'd expect when people are using water for purposes like washing dishes, for bathing. And so some of that will get into the wastewater, but then also the flushing of toilets alters the biological and chemical characteristics of it. Now, in contrast to domestic wastewater, industrial wastewater is typically going to have some evidence of the industry that the water is coming from. And depending on what type of industry we're talking about, those facilities might have treatment plants of their own that are completely independent of the municipal system, or sometimes they are doing a pre-treatment that will take the pollutant levels down to whatever would be acceptable for it then to go into the municipal network. And so sometimes wastewater from industries is completely excluded from our considerations, and other times it's integrated, but there could be some chemical constituents that are different from the concentrations you'd see in domestic wastewater. Infiltration and inflow is water that gets into the sewer that really shouldn't be there. It's either groundwater that seeps into the pipes, or it is storm water that's seeping into a sanitary sewer because of openings in manhole covers or connections from roof drains. So we'll talk a little bit about ways that we can quantify the effect of infiltration and inflow, the amount. But the economic burden of infiltration and inflow is hard to overestimate because although you'd think that groundwater and stormwater is diluting the wastewater, so I mean in one sense you might be forgiven for thinking that it's beneficial to have that good water mixed in with the polluted water because it's going to bring down the concentration of BOD, and that's true. But it turns out that the economic cost of pumping the water and aerating the added water that comes from infiltration and inflow dramatically outweighs whatever minor savings in cost that comes from having the wastewater diluted a bit by the added I&I flows. So I&I bad. Stormwater, what we mean by that is water that may have picked up a little bit of pollution from contact with the road. So there could be some salts in stormwater. There could be just sediments or sand or gravel in it. But typically it doesn't have the same biochemical oxygen demand as we'd see from domestic wastewater. And depending on the regulations in the area, sometimes stormwater is discharged straight to creeks without any kind of pre-treatment in advance because it doesn't have as much pollutant. Here is a pretty good illustration that maybe helps us to understand some of the challenges that are faced by wastewater treatment plant operators. And one of the first things that jumps out in this figure is that in a given town, there could be three different sewers. A storm sewer, which is completely separate and standalone, a sanitary sewer, which doesn't interact with the storm sewer, and then combined sewers where there's both domestic wastewater and stormwater. And that's the case here in Huntington. We have three different storm sewers, and sometimes they overlap. Three different sewers, one for storm, one for sanitary, and a combined. And different parts of Huntington that are relatively new may have a separate storm sewer, and the sanitary sewer doesn't accept any rainfall. But in a lot of the older part of town, there's just a single combined sewer where the quantity of water in the sewer varies depending on how rainy it is in a given time. So if you look at some of the things that have to be contended with, there could be grease discharge from restaurants that there are requirements to have traps in place to ensure that that oil and grease doesn't get to the treatment plant because there aren't effective ways to remove oily residue. Flotation can be a way of skimming it off of the top, but the grease that gets into storm sewers can have an effect of clogging the pipes and reducing capacity. So that's an important part of the pre-treatment, is ensuring that that oily substances and grease don't get into the sanitary sewer because of the problems that they cause. Another thing that kind of jumps out here is the effect of non-point source pollution. That is when there are animals in a field, for example, and it rains, and so the waste that runs off of the field is being discharged to a stream. That contributes to the environmental load in a stream, this non-point source pollution. And so it could be that a town is limited in how much pollution can come from their treatment plant because of non-point source pollution that is adding to the overall burden of pollutants in the river. So if you've got a lot of non-point source pollution, then that may reduce the quantity of pollutants that can be discharged in the permit that's issued to the wastewater treatment plant. Of course, when it comes to the stormwater, some of it comes from rain, some of it may come from snow melt, And when the weather changes really quickly, if you have a quick increase in temperature so that there's a lot of snow melting and then a storm happens at the same time, that can overwhelm a combined sewer. And when a combined sewer is overwhelmed, then it will go through an overflow. And here's a schematic that kind of illustrates the difference between a separate sanitary and storm sewer on the bottom. So here in the bottom you can see that it's a separate system where when it rains, the amount of water that's getting into the river or lake from the storm water is completely separate, and then the sanitary sewer volume doesn't increase, or at least it only increases by infiltration and inflow. But a combined sewer has more than I and I contributing to the flows. It's the actual discharge from parking lots, from downspouts, from building roofs. And so there's a little bit of a hydraulic feature like a dam where you could see where when the flow rates are relatively limited, then there wouldn't be any discharge to a stream. But when the water level is so high that the pipe to the treatment facility is full, then any excess is discharged into the stream nearby. And so if you ever go through Ritter Park on an especially rainy day, you'll smell sewage because there's combined sewer overflow events that happen here in Huntington on a pretty regular basis. Several times per year there will be so much storm water going into the combined sewer that the combined storm and wastewater discharge goes into Four Pole Creek. There's a couple places in Huntington where they discharge straight to the Ohio River, and people don't notice that as much because the waterfront here in Huntington is mostly either undeveloped or industrial areas. But people seem to notice it more in the Four Pole area because that's right next to Ritter Park, and there is, a lot more of people using that land and you're closer to it. So combined sewer overflow is a problem for the environment. It's dangerous for people because you're getting untreated wastewater into a place where, I've seen kids climbing around in Four Pole Creek before, and so it's real risky to have people in an environment with so much bacteria and viruses and other kind of wastewater contaminants. So if we talk about the nature of waste, sometimes people really struggle to wrap their brain around how BOD is a pollutant. What we're talking about is just the demand for oxygen. And it's one of the most important pollutants that we're trying to reduce through the wastewater treatment process. And I sometimes illustrate what is BOD by mentioning the case of just sugar. Sugar isn't necessarily in itself toxic. You can eat sugar, and you could argue that in the long term it causes health problems, but a couple of sugar cubes wouldn't kill you. But sugar is a pollutant when it's added to a stream, simply because of the effect that sugar could have on the stream. And it's not just sugar that causes BOD, it's anything that microorganisms can use as food. So it could be sugar, or it could be simpler, more complex starches besides the simple sugars. It could just be anything that the microorganisms can eat. And it's not necessarily the problem that microorganisms are eating that is an environmental concern for us, but it's that when they're eating this substrate, whether it be sugar or flour or whatever it is that the microorganisms are using as fuel, they also are consuming oxygen. And they're dividing more quickly when there's plenty of food. And so the population increases, and then that snowballs, even more dissolved oxygen is consumed. And so it's not so much the sugar itself, if it was discharged to a river, that we'd be worried about, but we'd be worried about the side effect of adding all of that food to a stream. And the side effect is that it causes the dissolved oxygen to decrease. New microorganisms will consume even more, and the dissolved oxygen could fall below the concentration that's needed to support things like fish. And it could fall far enough below the typical dissolved oxygen levels that you have anaerobic conditions, which is, a complete exhaustion of the dissolved oxygen. And when that happens, then the water becomes putrid. Dissolved sulfur, for example, can form hydrogen sulfide, which is a toxic and corrosive gas. And so whether that's happening in a stream or in the collection network, like in the sewer pipes, the formation of that hydrogen sulfide gas is a problem. So BOD is the demand for oxygen, and we're concerned about it because of the effect that it has on the receiving bodies. So different texts have different typical baseline concentrations for what's considered a strong, medium, and weak domestic wastewater. So this is a text that I've used before. It's different from ours, that suggests a weak domestic wastewater would have biochemical oxygen demand in the range of about 110 milligrams per liter, whereas on the strong end of the spectrum, maybe you'd have 400 milligrams per liter. And whether your wastewater is strong, medium, and weak in part depends on how much infiltration and inflow there is. It also depends a lot on geographic variations because of the difference in how much water gets used from place to place. There are some places where water is very inexpensive and people use more of it, and other places where water is costly and where the construction of the sewers is more modern and there's less seepage of groundwater and less stormwater getting into the domestic wastewater, and so the concentration would be stronger when there's less of that dilution. So what we're aiming for in wastewater treatment is typically, like as a baseline, trying to get the biochemical oxygen demand below 30 milligrams per liter, and the same for suspended solids. Now, different towns have different permits on how much they're allowed to discharge, but 25 to 30 milligrams per liter for each is maybe a pretty good starting point for understanding what we're trying to accomplish. And so if we just use this middle concentration here, what we're saying is we're trying to take the BOD from around 220 milligrams per liter down to 30 milligrams per liter. And we're trying to take the suspended solids from maybe a total of 720 milligrams per liter down to 25 to 30 milligrams per liter. So these are the characteristics of the raw wastewater as it's coming in. Here's our text and how it characterizes the weak, medium, and strong domestic wastewater. And so if we compare the BOD, they're saying that middle ground is maybe around 200 milligrams per liter for BOD. And then the suspended solids, the volatile component of that would be 160 milligrams per liter, where the fixed solids, which can't be consumed by microorganisms, are around 50 milligrams per liter. So the fixed solids need to be settled, where the volatile suspended solids can be settled, or through biological action can be consumed. The EPA breaks the wastewater categories into what they call conventional and non-conventional pollutants. And conventional can be removed through just the typical primary and secondary wastewater treatment, where the primary is going to be usually a settling clarifier. The secondary treatment would be either aeration or a trickling filter. And so through those settling, gravity separation, and activated microbial removal processes, you can remove BOD, suspended solids, and oil, assuming you've got an effective means of floating it to the top of a clarifier. But then non-conventional treatment, these are all pollutants that can't be easily removed from the typical primary and secondary treatment. And so non-conventional pollutants, when they exist in an industrial wastewater, have to be either removed at the point of generation, or municipal facility has to be prepared with specialized removal to ensure that these don't get into the environment. And the EPA goes even further and prohibits certain types of wastewater from entering the collection network altogether. For example, for obvious reasons, it's not allowed to discharge flammable or explosive materials to a a sanitary sewer. Even though the hydrogen sulfide is a gas that can cause a lot of problem, it pales in comparison to what would happen if someone was discharging gasoline or explosives down into the sewer. Another prohibited substance is they don't allow corrosive materials, anything with a pH of less than 5, which could cause pitting and erosion of concrete or any kind of damage to the pumps that are going to exist downstream of the collection network. So corrosive materials aren't allowed, and solid materials shouldn't be discharged to the collection network because of the risk of clogging. And the same thing if there are pollutants that could turn into a gel, then that isn't permitted. And one place where that potentially comes up is there are certain substances which are liquid at warm temperatures, like especially in food processing or in like processing animal parts. If it has a lot of collagen or gelatin, and then when that is cooled down to the temperature that it's going to be in the sanitary sewer, it could become much more viscous or even set up as a gel. So any kind of pollutant that would have a dramatic change in its viscosity when it enters the sanitary sewer would be prohibited because it could have a clogging effect. Any pollutants that have concentrations that are so high that it would interfere with treatment aren't permitted. And a wastewater treatment plant usually is not able to change how quickly the bacterial action is working. It takes weeks to bring a plant into equilibrium and to have the right number of microorganisms in an aeration basin. And so if there's a facility that discharges a huge pulse of BOD in a really variable way, then that could overwhelm the treatment capacity of the plant. And so that would be considered a prohibited waste. Even if it's just ordinary BOD, if they were releasing huge quantities of it, followed by periods of relatively low concentration so that the variations was interfering with the plant's operation. Heat is another thing that can be a problem because if you have big changes in the temperature at the treatment plant, then that can affect the microbial activity. We've talked about the need to keep oil out of the treatment facility, and then anything that would generate a toxic gas directly, and then trucked and hauled pollutants like when people are pumping out septic tanks. You've maybe seen, they call them like honey trucks. It's prohibited to discharge wastes into the treatment plant, into the collection network that come from those trucked or hauled pollutant sources. They have to be taken straight to the treatment plant and accepted on a pretty closely monitored basis rather than put into the distribution network. And so I think is it Christmas Vacation when the guy's driving the, like, what is it? He's driving like a motorhome, and he's just kind of pumping the sewage down into the, so unfortunately he was violating EPA regulations in doing that. But, all right.
You serious?
Yeah. All right. So industrial pollutants can have a much higher concentration of pollutants that we're worried about. And if you think about BOD as being one of the most significant pollutants, fermentation processes like production of beer, for example, the BOD from that can be really high because they're taking grains, for example, malting them, which is turning the starches into really simple sugars that have a very quick, powerful effect on BOD. And so, you know, any kind of leftover grains that come after the fermentation process, if there's rinsing or washing from those fermentation processes, the BOD can be really high. And the same thing is true of animal processing facilities that, you know, blood and little bits of meat and stuff that gets rinsed down into the sanitary sewer after a slaughterhouse would have a lot of BOD in it, because there's just nutrients there that the microorganisms could break down. And so a lot of industrial operations have to have a separate pre-treatment or a standalone treatment facility that's completely independent of the wastewater treatment plant. And industrial pollutants can have some of these non-conventional things that have to be dealt with. These are the pollutants, to remember, that wouldn't be necessarily removed from primary and secondary treatment, and so it can be a mixed blessing when industry comes into town, because it provides jobs and maybe a tax base for a community, but then there can be unexpected costs as well if they start discharging dangerous metals or organic constituents to the wastewater treatment plant that they're not necessarily set up to accept. And this just reiterates that the target that we're aiming for in secondary treatment is, on an average monthly basis, no more than 30 milligrams per liter for BOD and suspended solids. And so if you have wastewater coming from a slaughterhouse or a food processing plant and it's really concentrated, then it can just be tremendously difficult to get the concentration of waste down below that target of 30 milligrams per liter. Now let's talk about temporal variation. And we've already looked at this figure, in fact, recently from the drinking water side of things, but the wastewater generation side of things is also peaking throughout the day. The generation of wastewater kind of lags the consumption of drinking water over time, but it has the same kind of diurnal shape, where there's a peak both in the morning and in the afternoon. But the interesting thing is, it's not just the flow rate that varies through the course of the day, but it's also the concentration of the waste. So it's not like a liter of wastewater at 4 a.m. has the same milligrams per liter of BOD as a liter of wastewater in the middle of the day. And the reason for that is that in the middle of the night, a larger proportion of what's in the sewer is going to be infiltration and inflow. And in the afternoon, a greater proportion of the wastewater is actually what's coming from people's houses or is coming from the industrial processes. And so in spite of the fact that the flow is varying, the strength of the waste is also varying a lot. And so to kind of even things out, a lot of wastewater treatment plants will have to size a flow equalization basin on the receiving end of the treatment plant, both to kind of equilibrate the rate of water that's going to get into the treatment plant, but also to try and make it so that the inflowing BOD and suspended solids concentrations aren't varying quite as much. So we'll talk about flow equalization basin sizing in a future class, but this really illustrates the need for it because of the huge swings in the amount of wastewater and the strength of the wastewater that gets into the collection network. So this was just on a one-day basis. This is, some typical day. But seasonally, things vary as well. And this is in Chicago. We're going to compare two different slides. We're going to compare Chicago to Modesto. Now, Chicago is a very cold climate. Modesto, California is a lot warmer. But they both experience seasonal variations in BOD and in the volume of wastewater that's coming in. The monthly flow compared to the average the average flow over a 5-year basis. And so in Chicago, for example, you can see that there's a lot more flow in the spring when they have runoff of snowmelt. So when you've got a spring thaw, then that also reduces the BOD compared to the average BOD. So an increase in the amount of water, a decrease in the strength of water. So if you're designing or even just understanding and operating a treatment plant and a collection network, you have to be kind of in tune with the industry that exists in the area and the weather patterns and how that is going to affect the loading of the treatment plant from the flow rate and the BOD side of things. So this is in Chicago. Now, Modesto, California, you may not know much about that region of California, but it's very productive agriculturally. The county that Modesto's in actually has more than $3 billion worth of agricultural activity each year. And that's just an enormous amount of agricultural activity. And so what we know about Modesto is it's relatively warm there, and they have a lot of agricultural activity. And this is 3 years worth of data. So from January of 1970 to January of 71, 72, 73, 72. So 3 years. And what you can see is that the highest flow and the highest BOD are at the same time, and it's towards the summertime. And it's because there are a lot of food packing plants in Modesto, and so when the harvest season comes and these food packing plants are being operated, they use a lot more water than normally during the rest of the year. They're discharging a lot to the treatment plant, and the BOD is much higher because when you're processing food and cutting it, there's some waste that isn't going to make it into the packaged food that's sold, and that ends up in the treatment plant. So this is just another illustration of the need to be sensitive to the economic activity in an area along with the weather patterns, because both of those things are going to affect the nature of the wastewater. And it can also vary from one year to the next, because of crop variability. Not every year, the crops aren't as successful every year. For example, I've heard that down in Florida, because of the hurricane that just came through, they've lost about 1/3 of their citrus crop. And so, this year oranges will be in shorter supply. They'll probably be more expensive than normal. And so any kind of agricultural activities that vary a lot from season to season, if you're doing your design and your planning, even if you do have data for a certain area that's real world data and you're trying to extrapolate into the future, you need to take into account the uncertainty that some years there may be relatively less flow generated during the harvest season and the BOD may be less, or it could be more if it's a bumper crop and a lot more food is being processed. So it would be important to look at things across time for something as unpredictable as food production.
Looking at it as more like a vacation thing, a vacation spot thing, is there going to be where you would have such a huge difference in flow over throughout the year where you have smaller periods? Does that affect it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're thinking like Myrtle Beach or Atlantic City or something. Yeah. Some vacation spots are popular year-round and others are really seasonal. So that's absolutely another thing that you'd have to take into account is designing things for the high season. But then the problem is, especially in the case of sewers, is sewers don't do really well when they're not being used much, because waste can settle to the bottom of the sewer and it won't get flushed downstream. And so there's a certain flow rate that's required for what they call self-cleansing. And so some of the problems that they run into for towns that have a really busy summer season and a really quiet winter season is that if they've sized their infrastructure for the demand that they'll have in the summer, sometimes there's not enough flow and not enough BOD to keep things running in the same way during the winter time. So it's just another complicating factor that a designer has to be ready to address. One way that we can look at variability in the flow rate that is going to be coming into a treatment plant is by how big the city is and the average daily flow that's being generated. Because just taking New York City and comparing it to Milton, in a big place like New York City, there's a lot more variety in industry. There's more variety in where people live and when they're awake. And so if you're having a lot of flow rate that's generated, it's typical to see a much lower peaking factor. So over here on the vertical axis, this ratio of average daily flow to the peak flow is just saying, for example, if you are living someplace, then you want to predict the maximum day compared to the average day. For a really large city, the maximum day may only be 1.5 times the average day. But in a relatively small city, now this is a logarithmic scale, so this is 3 times as much flow rate on the maximum day compared to the average day. So the dashed line here represents the maximum day. Here's the peak hour on the maximum day. Small towns have a lot more variability because they're closer together, and there isn't a what's called a routing effect, where in a place like New York City, if everyone flushed the toilet at the same time, because of the distance between where someone is flushing the toilet and the treatment plant, it's not all going to arrive at the same time. Because, you know, if you're up in Harlem and flush the toilet, it may take a couple of hours before that flush gets to the treatment facility. Whereas in smaller towns, if there's a big pulse of water entering the treatment plant, entering the collection network at the same time, it could arrive at the treatment plant at about the same time because there's less travel time to kind of spread out and distribute the flow demand. Let's talk a little bit about infiltration and inflow. The inflow is when you have rainwater getting into a sanitary sewer, and the rainwater shouldn't be there. And so if someone is connecting the drain from their roof, and it instead of going into the sanitary sewer, it would be better if they're just discharging it into their yard. But a roof drain connection into a sanitary sewer would contribute to the inflow. If there's some sort of a clean out or a manhole cover that's loose, that can contribute to inflow. Infiltration is when groundwater is getting into the collection network through cracks or through imperfections in how the pipes are joined together. Prior to 1980, it wasn't common to use rubber gaskets when joining sections of concrete pipe together. So at each one of the junctions, either a little bit of wastewater would leak out or a little bit of groundwater would leak in. And so that really contributed quite a lot of additional infiltration. But in about 1980, it became more common, and there were some rules put in place that required compression fitting in sewers, and so that reduced the amount of infiltration. So this is called I&I, and it's expensive because it's adding to the overall volume of water that has to be treated, and every cubic meter of water that comes into the treatment plant is going to require some electricity for moving it around with pumps, electricity for the aeration that's added to the secondary treatment, and so it's costly to have extra water that doesn't really need to be there. It doesn't need to be treated. Stormwater isn't polluted to begin with. In fact, it could be used as a resource if people captured the stormwater and used it to water their plants or somehow found a beneficial use for it. So our text illustrates some typical infiltration quantities prior to 1980, and the permitted amount was how much you planned on when you were sizing a pipe network, because you don't want the pipe network to only have enough capacity for the wastewater that is going to be generated, but you have to assume that over time it will become cracked and there will be imperfections, and so you do need to allow for some of the capacity of the pipe network to be this groundwater and stormwater that's going to get in there inevitably as the pipe ages. And so how much you should plan on was based on the area of land that's being serviced, and you can see that when you have new construction, the amount of infiltration inflow is going to be quite a lot less. Here's just another figure that our text shows of comparing old sewers to new sewers and the effect that compression fittings and more careful attention to how sewer pipes are laid out to ensure that they don't have differential settlement. And if you have a good flat bed for the sewer pipe to lay on, then it's not going to get as many cracks as a little bit more careless placement of those heavy, brittle concrete pipes that are so often used in wastewater collection. And so in this figure, to estimate the amount of infiltration that you'd have, you'd simply look at the service area, meaning the watershed upstream of a certain point, the amount of land area that's being drained to a certain point, and then you would take it to either whether it's an old sewer or a new sewer graph, and then to the left side, this would be the peak infiltration rate. And we size these pipes to handle the peak flows, and not just the average daily flow. You want it to be large enough that that the pipe isn't being overburdened. Okay, just I think there's this and one more. Okay, one thing I wanted to point out is that not all pipe networks flow by gravity. That sometimes there have to be forced mains where the water is collecting at a certain location and then pumped upward under pressure to the wastewater treatment plant. And so these pump stations are sometimes called lift stations because they are effectively lifting the hydraulic grade line of the wastewater. If you have a good grade, then it makes sense to have as much of the collection network operating from gravity as you can, because these pump stations are using electricity and it's costly, but there's often low points or features like railroad tracks or an underpass or something that make it impossible to have just purely gravity flow at a town. The one last thing that our book talks about is the considerations of applying sludge to the land, because we talked a little bit about the need to dewater sludge when we were in the groundwater, the drinking water portion of the course. So let's say that you're belt pressing sludge and drying it out, and sometimes you want to discharge it by disposing of it maybe as a fertilizer. But there are heavy metals that can accumulate in sludge, and so there are federal limits in place that address how much of any particular chemical constituent is allowed to be land applied. And similarly, there are regulations that are meant to address how much bacteria can be in sludge before it's land applied. And so some towns really put a lot of effort into trying to use their wastewater solids as a resource, turning it into things like mixing it with mulch and making it something that people could use in their gardens or to help grow their plants and so on, but keeping a close eye on the residual bacteria that are in that sludge as well as the metals is an important part of the solids management, which we'll get into later in the semester. So just to wrap up with one last look at these announcements, I'm going to ask you, if you're interested in the Nitro Bridge site visit, to RSVP, and the same thing with that barbecue. Just look to the emails that I sent yesterday, RSVP. We'd love to have you at either one of those. See you on Friday.